All right, so a couple of days ago over on Twitter, we had Elon Musk teaming up with Matt Taibbi to drop what they are calling the Twitter files. And essentially, the gist of what this was supposed to be is a massive exposing of how Twitter, before Elon Musk, was massively biased on behalf of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party when back in 2020, they essentially suppressed that Hunter Biden laptop story on the Twitter platform. Facebook also did this to a different extent in a slightly different way, but essentially working to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story and, in a sense, from the perspective of conservatives, giving him the election, right? I think that that's obviously a stretch too far. I don't think that this would have been even remotely close to the massive story that it is right now if it hadn't actually been suppressed by Twitter and become, in and of itself, its own scandal in regards to like free speech and censorship from big tech. But nonetheless, this is basically the culmination of years of conservatives talking about this Hunter Biden laptop story and big tech working against conservatives. So I wanted to just give a basic run through in terms of like what this is actually saying, what this is not saying, how some people are taking this a stretch too far. Definitely in terms of like expectations, this was closer to a nothing burger than it was to like some massively explosive story, because honestly, a lot of the stuff that they talk about that Matt Taibbi addresses in this is shit that we already knew, and then to the extent that there's some stuff that's scandalous or overreaching, it's definitely not the same firm connections that a lot of conservatives had hoped that there would have been between like the government and between Twitter at the time when they decided to take this action. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So here from Matt Taibbi, he says, thread the Twitter files, okay? And so he gives this whole big preamble, which was honestly kind of annoying the way that he tweeted this out, because he was doing it like individually, tweet by tweet, and then sometimes you'd have to wait like multiple minutes for the next tweet to come out. And he did this whole big preamble basically giving the background of Twitter and how it's supposed to be like the modern day public town square and free speech absolutismville, and then getting into how over the last couple of years they have drifted away from that original sort of Twitter concept and towards much more aggressive content moderation. So we're going to go ahead and start here at number 8. He says, by 2020, requests from connected actors to delete tweets were routine. One executive would write to another, quote, more to review from the Biden team, and the reply would come back, handled. Okay, so this is where it kind of gets a little bit interesting, right? So you have a message here from basically people who are working for the Biden campaign. Now, keep in mind, kind of important to note here, he was not the president at this time. Okay, so you could say, all right, maybe there were DNC operatives, they're sort of a tangential government organization. Joe Biden, obviously the former vice president, he's running for president. Obviously, they are political actors, but at the time, Joe Biden was not in power within the U.S. government, okay? And that's kind of important to note here in terms of judging the extent to which this is actually the government taking place in direct ordering of censorship on these social media platforms versus a private citizen or somebody who is on the campaign trail like Joe Biden trying to get certain things taken off of Twitter. Now, the other thing that's very important to understand about this is that some people actually looked into these previous posts, which have obviously now since been deleted, but there are websites that you can go and look and see what they were before they got deleted. And if you actually look at these tweets, it seems like overwhelmingly the ones that the Biden administration was trying to get Twitter to take down were basically just like Hunter Biden dick pics. Okay, so just as a reminder with the Hunter Biden whole laptop scandal and the story surrounding that, right? His laptop apparently gets dropped off at this computer repair shop. Then apparently he forgets about it or something. They come into, into their hands comes the contents of his laptop one way or another, and they release all of this information, right? So some of the stuff that was on that laptop was just shit about like Hunter Biden's dick and, him doing different various drugs like cocaine or whatever, and him hooking up with a bunch of different sex workers. So there was some stuff which is just totally like, okay, that's his personal shit. Obviously, Hunter Biden has a history of drug abuse. Hope he gets better with that over the long run, but that's not something that is politically relevant. The stuff that was politically relevant, that was potentially included in that, were things that were pertaining to like emails back and forth that may or may not have been talking about Joe Biden and talking about, a lot of these different positions that Hunter Biden, these jobs that he was able to get throughout the course of his dad's political career, which, let me just say this up front, 100% is nepotism. Okay, there's no question about it. Hunter Biden would not have been in the position within a lot of these, like the Ukrainian energy firm. He wouldn't have been in that job other than the fact that he was Joe Biden's son, okay? Other than the fact that a lot of these other governments or companies or whoever it may be, these political actors wanted to get closer access to somebody who was actually wielding political power. They weren't out looking for Hunter Biden's, expertise when it comes to energy or any of the other, companies that he was working for, right? So it's definitely nepotism. It's definitely corruption to an extent, right? Obviously. But at the same time, if the things that they were trying to get Twitter to remove were mostly focused about Hunter Biden's dick pics and not about like somebody talking about the corruption or not ordering Twitter to take down things that are just like general critiques of Joe Biden, well, then that's just like completely defensible, right? That's not a problem at all to say that the Biden campaign was trying to get tweets taken down that may have, worked their way past the initial, Twitter content moderation team and, asking them to take down Hunter Biden dick pics. That's not a problem. Now, again, if it was the case that they were trying to censor those other government corruption allegations, that would be a problem. But as he's going to talk about in the rest of this thread, there's no indication that that was the case. And it seems like it was just them asking for a lot of these like personal things to be taken down, which is against Twitter's terms of service. So it's stuff they should have already taken down. And I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. But again, in terms of the corruption story, I think there's definitely truth to that. But at the same time, it's like, really, this is your big, like, the equivalent of like the Hillary Clinton email scandal and Benghazi and all of that. This is what they think is going to be the big gotcha for Joe Biden, is the fact that like his son was running around and trading on his name and, getting political payouts for that or getting some sort of financial rewards for that. That's really not that surprising. Number one, it's not anything new. Number two, and number three, that's shit that Donald Trump and his family did rampantly throughout their administration. So like, obviously, I, as an outside observer, as a leftist who has somewhat objective principles on issues like corruption, I think both of those families are massively corrupt and probably do belong behind bars, okay? Whether it's Hunter Biden trading on his dad's name, whether it's, Ivanka Trump also trading on her dad's name in position of power while she was literally in the White House. I mean, you're making these connections between Hunter Biden and this energy firm or whatever and these other various companies and the fact that his dad was, in power at that time and trying to loop all of these things together to form a coherent narrative. You don't even have to do that for the Trump family. He just straight up brought his family into the White House with him while they were still operating their businesses. I mean, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, got over $2 billion as they walked out of the White House from the Saudis, who admitted at the time that it wasn't even a good investment. Now he's potentially going to be re-entering the White House, depending on what happens in 2024, if Donald Trump is successful in winning. That's just rank corruption. I mean, total, open, brazen corruption coming from the Trump family. So it's kind of like, while I think that it is good and objective to, critique both of those things and to condemn both of those things and to try to push for legal consequences or political consequences at the very least for both of those things from both of those families, from the perspective of Republicans, it's just kind of like bizarre that you would focus in on the issue of nepotism and familial corruption when that was sort of like Donald Trump's whole shtick. But regardless, I mean, this is what they're going with and this is what they're focusing on. But again, important to note, the things that they were asking them to remove here did not pertain to the specifics of the Hunter Biden laptop story or any corruption allegations. Okay, he continues. He says celebrities and unknowns alike could be removed or reviewed at the behest of a political party. Okay, so that's bad as well, right? I don't think that if you're talking about tweets that are just like critical of Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden or the Democratic Party or any Republican politicians for that matter, you shouldn't have the RNC or the DNC or either political party or their organizations be able to just get in quick communication with Twitter and say, we want this censored because we disagree with it politically, right? That would totally be a violation of the principle of free speech, right? But I don't even know that that's what was happening here. If it was in some certain cases, that obviously is terrible. That's pretty bad. That's pretty explosive, right? But he continues. And this is another important point. He says both parties had access to these tools. For instance, in 2020, requests from both the Trump White House and the Biden campaign were received and honored. However, he goes on to say that basically this is heavily slanted in favor of Democrats because they have many more open channels of communication with the Twitter teams because Twitter has employees that disproportionately happen to be more liberal or more Democratic, right? That's somewhat of a fair point. It probably was more skewed in terms of access and availability to get certain things taken down or moderated on behalf of Democrats. That part is true, but hold on a second. You can't just gloss over this part up here where you said both parties had access to these tools. For instance, in 2020, requests from both the Trump White House, okay, while he was president at the time, Joe Biden was not president, okay? So to say the Trump White House and the Biden campaign were, sending these orders to Twitter to take certain people off of the platform at their behest, right? At this time, the Biden campaign, he's not in a position of political power. The Trump White House was. That is an actual instance, depending on the details of this, because we didn't get any of the details in terms of what they were actually trying to remove from the Trump White House. This is the only time that Matt Taibbi really mentions this in this entire breakdown here, which is kind of bizarre, right? Because this would be even a bigger story than, the Biden Biden campaign asking them to take things down. You're talking about the actual president of the United States and his lackeys going around and directly messaging with Twitter employees to say, we want this taken down. What did he ask to get taken down, right? Was it like death threats or something that's actually illegal and a violation of free speech, or the principles of free speech? Or was it something that was just something he disagreed with, right? Or was it just some left-wing account? We don't know. We don't have any more details on that, but I would like to see an actual follow-up in terms of like what the Trump White House was having taken down, right? But again, it's important to understand here. Number one, doesn't look like the Biden White House or the Biden campaign or the Trump White House were at the time directly working to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story. That was just happening within Twitter itself, right? So they continue down here. He continues down here. I'm going to skip ahead to number 17 it is. All right, so he says, on October 14th, 2020, the New York Post published Biden's secret emails, an expose based on the contents of Hunter Biden's abandoned laptop. Okay, so this was the initial story. They say Twitter took extraordinary steps to suppress the story, removing links and posting warnings that it may be unsafe. They even blocked its transmission via direct message, a tool hitherto reserved for extreme cases such as CP. They say the White House spokeswoman at the time, Kayleigh McEnany, was locked out of her account for tweeting about the story, prompting a furious letter from the Trump campaign staffer Mike Hahn, who seethed, "At least pretend to care," for the next 20 days. And they say this led to public policy executive Caroline Storm to send out a polite "what the fuck" query. And several employees noted that there was tension between the comms and policy teams, who had little or less control over moderation, and the safety and trust teams. Okay, so there was basically, as he goes on to point out here, a big disagreement that was happening at the upper levels of Twitter about why they were removing this, what was the justification for them for removing this, and whether or not they should continue doing so. But I mean, again, this is pretty crazy, right? So this part up here, the fact that they suppressed this this story from being spread, that's terrible, right? That is a violation of the principles of the First Amendment. Now, again, Twitter is a private company, unfortunately. Obviously, Elon Musk calls this the modern day public town square, still thinks that the modern day public town square should be in the hands of a single individual billionaire who gets to just on a whim decide what he's going to allow on the platform and not. But regardless of the arguments surrounding, Twitter being a private corporation, they are a private corporation, and so they don't technically have to abide by the standards of the First Amendment. But just on like a principled view of this, yeah, you should not have suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story, right? That was totally out of left field, totally unacceptable, obviously. But again, that wasn't the government that was telling them to do that. That was just Twitter. Now, there are some stories that have come out about like, oh, the FBI was warning them about potentially, some Russian disinformation story that was coming down the pipeline. Maybe they just interpreted that as though this was that story that the FBI was talking about. Maybe that's the case. But again, that was the FBI under the Trump administration, right? That wasn't Joe Biden and his, political partisan actors. Okay, so, that's another important piece to just remind ourselves as we're going through this. Yes, this was unacceptable. Yes, this was, suppression of free speech. But this was Twitter doing this, right? This is a problem with having the public town square be operated by a private corporation like this, right? This isn't a problem with government direct censorship, right? This could be a problem with those other instances, depending on what the Trump White House wanted to get taken down, and potentially, what the Biden administration, as he has been in office, has been trying to get taken down. We don't know a lot of that, right? There was a great story that came out from The Intercept by Ken Klippenstein and Lee Fong. They talked about like the truth cops and basically the DHS stepping in to try to engage with content moderation on different social media platforms and advising them on what to allow on their platforms. So the idea that like the government is engaging in censorship on these social media platforms, there's huge truth to that. But on the specifics of this Hunter Biden laptop story, it's just not the case, right? So they continue down here. They say, although several sources recalled hearing about a general warning again from federal law enforcement about possible foreign hacks, there's no evidence that I've seen of any government involvement in the laptop story. In fact, that might have been the problem. Okay, he says the decision was made at the highest levels of the company, but without the knowledge of the then CEO, Jack Dorsey, with a former head of legal policy and trust, Gade, playing a key role in this. Okay, so, and then he gets into more of the chaos surrounding the backroom conversations between Twitter employees and their comms team and policy and safety and trust and all of that. But, I mean, this is a pretty important point here, right? There's no evidence that Matt Taibbi has seen of any government involvement in the laptop story. Okay, so if there's no government involvement in the laptop story, then what the fuck was the point of all this hype around the Twitter files, right? right? That was sort of like the core the core allegation here that conservatives have been running with, was that this was the government stepping in to censor this story. And he's saying there's no evidence that there was any government enforcement of this policy. Okay, so what is this all about? I mean, it just seems like, again, this is closer to a nothing burger than anything else. We kind of knew all of the rest of this, but, I mean, I guess there's another interesting part that I'll just touch on here real quick, because Ro Khanna actually comes up in these leaks as somebody who was, sort of defending the Post when they came out with this story and calling out Twitter behind the scenes for suppressing this story. So he says, in one humorous exchange on day one, Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna reached out to Gad to gently suggest she hop on the phone to talk about the backlash in regards to speech. And Khanna was the only Democratic official that I could find who expressed concern. So then she responded back to him, not really understanding what his main point was. And then he gets into this. So here's what Ro Khanna said. He says, "Hope you're well, but this seems like a violation of the First Amendment principles. If there is a hack of classified information or other information that could expose a serious war crime, and the New York Times was to publish it, I think the NYT should have that right. A journalist should not be held accountable for the illegal actions of the sources unless they actively aided the hack. So, to restrict the distribution of that material, especially regarding a presidential candidate, seems not in keeping with the principles of New York Times v. Sullivan. I say this as a total Biden partisan and convinced that he didn't do anything wrong, but the story has now become more about censorship than relatively innocuous emails, and it's become a bigger deal than it would have been. It is also now leading to serious efforts to curtail Section 230. So that's basically what Ro Khanna's response was, and honestly, I agree with him. Listen, I mean, again, the main takeaways here are that, number one, it doesn't look like, as conservatives have maybe hoped that was the case, that you had direct, Democratic political figures that were in power, in positions of power at the time, that were working to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story specifically. It looks like it was basically just a clusterfuck of miscommunications at the upper levels of Twitter, and maybe, the FBI warning that they got a week earlier played somewhat of a role in their decision, and maybe thinking, oh, this is against our hacking policy or whatever, or this is something we need to look out for, and they erred on the side of suppression instead of letting it just run free. I mean, you kind of understand that a little bit to some extent, because if you're putting yourself back in that context at the time, very heated primary contest between Joe Biden, or general election contest between Joe Biden, Donald Trump. Obviously, there's a lot of different allegations floating around, some of which are completely deranged and bullshit, and some of which are valid and justified, and so you kind of get the chaos to an extent. But again, the main problem here is exactly what Ro Khanna was just pointing out there, right? This is clearly a violation of the principles of the First Amendment, but the follow-up to that is that these companies don't really have to abide by the principles of the First Amendment. We can hope that they do, we can urge them to, but if they're in the hands of private for-profit corporations, then that's what they're going to be operated for. I mean, this is like, we saw this with Elon Musk and all of the new Twitter policies that he's been trying to roll out, and he's essentially going to try to stratify this entire platform along an economic hierarchy, right? If you pay for his, special $8 per month verified badge, you'll get elevated. If you say something that he thinks is negative, which is the actual word that he used to define what would be suppressed, then you're going to be downgraded in the algorithms on Twitter. And he even defined it as though, if you're somebody who's engaging in negative speech, whatever that means. I mean, from my perspective, we're talking about one of the most fragile billionaires with the biggest ego on the planet. That could be me pushing for unions, or criticizing billionaires or something like that. Maybe that gets suppressed. So I mean, the problem here is perfectly exemplified in the fact that Elon Musk was able to buy Twitter in the first place, and now has essentially unilateral control over what type of content goes on to what he himself calls the public town square, right? If it's the public town square, it should be operated to the benefit of the public. It shouldn't be operated at the behest of advertisers, or at the behest of a board of directors that get to sit on the top of the public town square and just determine everything themselves, right? Obviously, there's boundaries to free speech. There's legal boundaries to free speech. There are practical boundaries to free speech when you're talking about an online social media platform. Obviously, if you look at some of these other examples where they just let anybody say anything with no restrictions whatsoever, usually they do devolve into little Nazi breeding ground hellscapes that nobody would want to be on anyways. So there are definitely some parameters that you have to take, some guardrails that you have to put in place to just have a functioning communication platform with millions and millions of people on it. But at the same time, if you were stepping in and suppressing some massive political story like the Hunter Biden laptop shit, then that is, obviously a dramatic overreach from this company, right? Okay, that is obviously completely unacceptable. Now, if it's on things like Hunter Biden dick pics, that's perfectly fine. That shouldn't be on there. That's literally just revenge porn. It's against their terms of service. So, I mean, again, this might seem kind of complicated to a large extent, but it's really not at the end of the day. I mean, obviously, it was more of a nothing burger than I think a lot of people were anticipating or hoping for. You know, you didn't have some top Democratic Party officials who were ordering them to suppress the laptop story. It's really more of a story in terms of like monopolization and market consolidation, and how, you know, we are essentially putting our modern day public town squares into the hands of literally a handful, or in the case of Twitter now, a single hand, or you know, two hands, I guess, with Elon Musk, and just letting them unilaterally determine the boundaries of what is considered free speech, what is considered acceptable on the platform, and who is going to be elevated, who is going to be promoted on these vitally important communication platforms that we built up now.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying